Thank you, Jim. It was mentioned that the Heartland Institute takes pride in dealing with state legislators. There is a member of the General Assembly, Representative Morrison, here. Would you please introduce yourself and tell us where your district is?
Tom Morrison. I'm from Palatine, and I'm in my second term.
Well, thank you for your service to Illinois. And an old friend of mine and former president of the Illinois State Society, who's running for judge in the 1st Judicial District, John Curry.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
And I have to remember my relatives. I have a sister here, a brother here, and 2 cousins. And would all of them please just wave? All right, and also I can't forget my publisher, Jameson Campaign, without whom my book would not be possible. Let me start off, I fall under the education category of the interests of the Heartland Institute because I believe very strongly that we neglect history in schools today. To the best of my knowledge, only the state of Texas requires study in state history as one of the requirements for graduation. Most states, if they cover the topic at all, lump it in with some regional part of American history or with social studies or all kinds, but they don't give it the attention it really deserves. And Illinois has it listed on its core curriculum objectives, but again, there's not much follow-up. So let me start by just telling some of the anecdotes that I've learned in doing the research for the book, because I think that students, especially high school and college students, will learn better about American history and about state history if you tell them the stories of the people who made these historic events rather than just a timeline of what the events were. So I think this studying the history of these people, their biographies, is a lot of fun. I'm going to give you a few questions. First off the bat, does anyone know who said, "My uncle was the town drunk"? And that was really embarrassing because we lived in Chicago at the time. Anyone have an idea? This same person also said on the Johnny Carson show, "Did you ever feel like the world was a tuxedo and you're a pair of brown shoes?"
Bob Newhart.
No, not Bob Newhart. Good guess. Marty. George Goebel, exactly. And what was George Goebel to Illinois? Well, he grew up here in Chicago. He was a child star on WLS radio. Played the guitar, wore a cowboy hat when he was only about 10 years old, and he was called Lonesome George, and that's where he got his nickname. And then he moved out to California in the 1950s, had his own star of his own show on CBS. Now, there's one of my favorite political comments. A Chicago politician introduced the Prince of Wales to a crowd that had gathered below a hotel balcony here in Chicago. And his introduction to the Prince was, "Prince, these are the boys. Boys, this is the Prince." And that was Mayor Long John Wentworth in 1860 introducing Edward Albert, the Prince of Wales. Kind of sums up Chicago politics even of that time, I think. Another favorite political story of mine is about Mclean Stevenson, who was the actor from Bloomington, who played the role of Colonel Henry Blake on MASH. If you remember that program, Mclean one night was on the Johnny Carson show, and Johnny said, "Now tell me, I know you're from Bloomington, how are you related to Senator Adlai E. Stevenson III?" Mclean said, "Well, right now, I'm his cousin, but if he's ever elected president, I'm going to be his brother." So, Mayor Cermak was a highly quotable individual. But one of the quotes I love, he was running against Big Bill Thompson for mayor in 1931. And Big Bill Thompson was an Irish boss who was a little contemptuous of some of the new Eastern European immigrants to Chicago. And he said in a very nasty way, "Tony, Tony, where's your pushcart at? Can you imagine a World's Fair mayor with a name like that?" And Tony Cermak said, "Well, he don't like my name. It's true I didn't come over on the Mayflower, but I came as soon as I could." So Tony, I think that turned the election around for Tony right then and there because people were so So pleased with that answer. Another one was, this has to do with the president of the University of Chicago in 1905, the first president, William Rainey Harper. And John D. Rockefeller had been recruited as his main fundraiser, chairman of his financial advisory committee. John D. Rockefeller said of Harper one night, "I gave him an unlimited budget and he exceeded it." And so I often use that quote to University of Chicago administrators today, and they said, nothing's changed. Anyway, I think the study of American history, and specifically state history, is a lot of fun. I had a great deal of fun researching the book. It didn't start where most Illinois histories start. The last one, about 40 years ago, by Paul Angle, was a magnificent book called The Prairie State. But he started with colonial times and then statehood. I decided to take a different angle because I was unveiling new ground, plowing new ground with newspaper archives about the group that I was once president of and that John Curry was once president of, the Illinois State Society of Washington, D.C. I decided I would start with the beginning of that society in 1854 and then go forward. Basically, I was challenged by a professional historian from the National Archives who said, "I've read in your materials that Abraham Lincoln was a member of the Illinois State Society. Can you prove this?" And I did some research and I wasn't able to prove it. I think for a very practical reason, that during the Civil War, Abe Lincoln was very busy managing the affairs of the country, and he didn't have time to leave the White House to go to meetings of the Illinois State Society. However, the Illinois State Society, 300 members, did go to him on the day after his inauguration on March the 5th, 1861, and that I was able to document with local newspapers at the time. I was fortunate in that at the time I was doing this research, about 2004, 2005, it was I didn't have to go anyplace. At that time, a company called ProQuest had discovered a technology where PDF files could be searchable by data, and also you could search the articles for free, and if you wanted to buy a copy of the article, it was $1.25, so it was a very economical way. And I urge all of you today, they have digitized the Chicago Tribune way back to 1847, the Washington Post, the Washington Times, the New York Times. It is just a great resource for doing research because it allows you to travel in time. That's the wonderful thing about it. You learn more about how people lived in their daily lives. So I started in 1854 with the establishment of the Illinois Democratic Club of Washington City. And it was called that for a couple of years while Franklin Pierce was president. And then magically overnight, in 1861, when Abe Lincoln came in, guess what? It became the Illinois Republican Club of Washington City. And the name would change back and forth over the years, depending on who was in the White House. It was mostly Republicans for the next 50 or 60 years, except for Grover Cleveland and Adlai Stevenson, from Bloomington, Illinois, who was vice president under Grover Cleveland. Thank you, I forgot. These newspaper articles are wonderful. So there's a lot of, we came up with the metaphor. I borrowed the metaphor from a 1920s newsletter of the Illinois State Society, that this group of colony of expatriates in Washington, D.C. was the 103rd county of Illinois. There are 102 counties actually, but in Illinois, this actual group of people became known as the 103rd county, but of course they came from all the other 102 counties. And we had some wonderful characters. The Vice President of the United States under Cleveland, Adlai Stevenson. The Vice President of the United States under Calvin Coolidge was Charles Dawes from Evanston. His home is now the home of the Evanston Historical Society. Charles Dawes was not only a Nobel Prize winner in the Nobel Prize for Peace for work he had done with Sir Austen Chamberlain of England on stabilizing the currencies of Europe after the First World War. He was had been a key assistant to General Jack Pershing during the First World War, a very prominent family. His brother, Rufus Dawes, was head of the World's Fair here in Chicago in 1933. He had another brother, William Dawes, who was head of the Chicago Association of Commerce and Industry. But I thought it was really cool that his great-grandfather was William Dawes, who rode the same night that Paul Revere rode to alarm the towns in Massachusetts that the British regulars were coming. And on top of all of that, he wrote a song, a musical composition called Piano Concerto in A minor. Sounds pretty boring. But in about 1950, a lyricist pushed his doorbell in Evanston, came in to see him, and he said, "Mr. Dawes, I like your tune. I'd like to add words to it." It became a very popular song called It's All in the Game. It was recorded by everybody from Tony Bennett to Elton John. It was and is still a popular song today, still earning royalties for the Dawes family. So here's a person who had an unbelievably diverse career that is, I would say, virtually forgotten to most Illinois students if they've ever heard of him. Didn't know he was a vice president, didn't know he was from Evanston. I think that's a shame. I'd like to remind students of who these people were. We've had Senate minority leaders, Supreme Court justices. We've had one Chief Justice from Illinois in the late 1800s. We've had associate justices like John Paul Stevens and Arthur Goldberg and other individuals who are outstanding in their own right. I worked in 1967 for Everett Dirksen, the late U.S. Senator from Illinois. Senator Dirksen had a really interesting way of expressing himself. During the 1962 campaign, he was running against Congressman Sid Yates of Chicago. Yates was sort of the sacrificial lamb. Jack Kennedy didn't really want to campaign against Dirksen because he needed Dirksen, and he didn't think the Democratic candidate could win anyway. But in a debate down in Peoria, basically a labor leader who did not like Dirksen's stand on the Taft-Hartley Act hollered out from the crowd, "Dirksen, you're a bum. I'd never vote for you. I wouldn't vote for you if you were St. Peter." Dirksen said, "Sir, if I were St. Peter, you wouldn't be in my district." He of course said also, "A billion here, a billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money," when in an appropriations committee hearing. So Dirksen was one of the fascinating characters from Illinois in Congress. He was a giant killer because he defeated the Democratic majority leader under Harry Truman, Scott Lucas, who was also from Illinois. And we've had a wide variety of interesting members of Congress. We've had, can anyone name the 6 first ladies that have come from the state of Illinois or who lived here? All right, we've got the 4 presidents, Grant, Lincoln, Ronald Reagan, and Barack Obama. The wives of those 4 presidents are all first ladies, obviously. But in addition, from Park Ridge, Hillary Clinton, okay, and from Chicago. A lot of people don't get this one. Betty Ford. Betty Ford, that wasn't her original name, but she grew up here. She was born and grew up in Chicago before moving to Michigan. So we've got a lot of interesting people in that area. Another individual that I talk about in the book, I talk about many different people. Of course, Mayor Daley, with many of his quotable quotes, and I'm talking about Mayor Richard J. Daley, the father of Mayor Richard M., who was nice enough to write a pub note for my book. These characters, the political characters from Illinois, are a really deep well of information on the culture of the state. But even beyond that, the business leaders of Illinois, I think, have some fascinating stories. Some of you probably don't know the story of James Kraft, who came here in the very early part of the century. He was fired by the people he was working for in New York, and he only had $80 in his pocket, stranded here in Chicago. He was originally from Canada. So James Kraft went out and found somebody who would sell him a horse. Daisy or some sort of horse. Anyway, he took the horse down to Water Street, started buying wheels of cheese, and decided he could get, if he got there early enough in the morning, he could sell the cheese to the merchants downtown, save them a trip, and then get his cheese distribution company started. Well, pretty soon he had his brothers, the Kraft brothers, started, and then he took off during World War I because he developed special tin cans and containers that would keep the cheese fresh so he could serve American troops who were fighting overseas. We had Richard Sears and Alva Roebuck. Richard Sears was from Minnesota originally. He was a watch salesman, and he met up with Alva Roebuck, who was from Indiana. Alva was a watch repairman, and they understood that Montgomery was onto something when he started his mail order catalog. But the problem with Montgomery Ward's catalog was that it was text only. So Sears and Roebuck decided, we'll come up with a mail order catalog, but ours is going to be illustrated. We're going to show pictures, drawings of what the product is. And they took over the mail order catalog industry, was hugely successful, very popular, and for years and years and years, the Sears Roebuck catalog, or just the Sears catalog today, was a godsend for people who lived in rural areas who didn't normally have a chance to come into a big city and see the variety of products, but they could order them through the mail. And Chicago was ideally suited for this kind of distribution network for the entrepreneurs because of the railroads and the transportation hub that was here. We had Oscar Mayer. Oscar Mayer came here basically for the Chicago Columbian Exposition of 1893. He was somebody who knows German can correct me, a Wurstmacher, a sausage maker. And anyway, his contribution was that he brought his brothers over, formed the Oscar Mayer Company, which became hugely successful. Because of that Columbian Exposition of 1893, people don't realize today what a life-changing event that was. Remember, the Chicago fire had only been 20 years before, or 22 years before. So the entire city had to be rebuilt, and then millions of people came to the Columbian Exposition. People came, all sorts of interesting people came. The father of Knut Rockne, the great Notre Dame coach, came here because he wanted to show off the carriages that he had made in Norway, and he decided he liked Chicago so much he was going to move his whole family here. So Knut grew up on the northwest side, and then eventually went to work for about 4 years before he went to Notre Dame to become both a student and later a coach. So the World's Fair of both 1893 and the follow-up Century of Progress Fair of 1933 were major events, particularly the World's Fair of 1933, because the reason that the federal government decided to finally go after Al Capone was not just because they wanted to get a criminal off the streets. There was an economic motive. How many of you have heard of the Secret Six? All right, there were 6 businessmen in Chicago. I'm going to struggle with the names now. One was Samuel Insull, one was George Paddock, one was Julius Rosenthal, the head of Sears Roebuck at the time, one of the Dawes brothers, Randolph Isham. Okay, anyway, these 6 business leaders, after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, they started to get very scared. They figured if people around the country think Chicago is unsafe, they can't bring their families here because of gangland violence in the streets of Chicago, they decided that we've got to get rid of Al Capone. So because of former Vice President Dawes being related to the brother of the head of the Chicago Association of Commerce and Industry, went to President Hoover and said, please help us with special help. We can't get much help, or any, from the Chicago Police Department because so many of them are on Capone's payroll. So basically, President Hoover went to his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon said, went to Elliot Ness, who was a young prohibition agent here in Chicago. Elliot was born here in 1903. His parents also were from Norway, and Elliot was the brother-in-law of Alexander Jamie, who was with the Bureau of Investigation that later became the FBI. So they decided they would start building a case against Al Capone. They used the Volstead Act to raid the breweries and speakeasies that were the source of Capone's money and power. And then they decided to turn over their evidence to the U.S. Attorney. Later, one of the later U.S. attorneys was Dwight Green, who later became governor of Illinois. But the U.S. attorneys decided they would go after Capone on income tax evasion. It was sort of a novel approach at the time, but it worked. They got him convicted for income tax evasion, and because he was now in federal prison, people felt more relaxed about coming to Chicago, and they did. 39 million people came to the World's Fair of 1933, which was more than the Columbian Exposition had been 30 years before. But it was also very energizing for the city of Chicago to have all these new people come again, and there were side benefits from that fair, which was of tremendous long-term lasting impact for the city. So these are some of the things. I've forgotten some of the other trivia questions I was going to ask you, but we have a lot in the book about the people of Illinois who were in D.C., of course. The book proceeds on two different tracks simultaneously. On one track, you're getting the history of the Illinois State Society and its people, all of whom were from Illinois. On the other track, you're getting the history of what was going on back here in the state at the time. So it's really a tale of three cities. The three cities are Springfield, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. Now, to give you an example of just one story that happened to tie all those three cities together. I told this story on WLS about 8 weeks ago on the Dan Proft and Bruce Rauner show. There was a congressman, if you look at the Blagojevich scandal of a few years ago, where the Governor Blagojevich was accused of trying to sell Barack Obama's Senate seat, it is nothing new. I mean, exactly 100 years before that scandal, exactly 100 years in the year 1909, a congressman from Chicago by the name of Billy Lorimer, under the old system, the legislature elected the U.S. Senator. There was no popular election then. Lorimer's supporters bribed a majority of all the members of the General Assembly in both parties, and when it came time for indictments to come down to get the people who had made the bribes, then the same people bribed two juries to acquit them. And now that's chutzpah. I mean, really, it's an amazing tale of, and frankly, that bribe led to a change in the U.S. Constitution. It was sort of the final scandals. That one and a similar one in Pennsylvania led to a drive to change the U.S. Constitution so that no longer state legislatures would elect the member of the U.S. Senator. From then on, it was direct election only after 1912 and 1914, I think was the first election under the new system. So these are, Chicago isn't just about politics or scandals. There's a lot of positive stories in Chicago history about our entrepreneurs, about our sports teams. Another one I told on WLS recently was about my favorite story about George Halas. Well, first of all, I'll take a step back. When George Halas almost died in 1915, he was an employee of the Western Electric in Cicero, lived with a lot of other bohemian people in Cicero. He was on his way to board a touring boat called the Eastland in the Chicago River, and he got there late. And because he got there late, he saw from a bridge the entire Eastland rolled over on its side. Terrible loss of life. More than 800 people lost their lives in what was the greatest disaster on water in Chicago at that time, but not George Halas because he was late. And anyway, George Halas person who is now working for ESPN, was a young reporter with Sporting News back in 1978. He got very excited because he had an exclusive interview with George Halas. And he didn't know what to say, so he said, well, Mr. Halas, who was the greatest running back you ever saw? George Halas said, got to be Red Grange from the University of Illinois. And the reporter said, well, if Red Grange were playing today, how many yards do you think he'd rush for? Halas said, oh, about 700. And the reporter said, well, 700, that's just okay. And Halas said, son, you got to realize something. Red Grange is 75 years old. So we've had wonderful baseball stories over the years with Bill Veeck, and I told the story on May the 22nd about, a lot of people don't remember that when the White Sox beat Cleveland in 1959, Fire Commissioner Robert Quinn was such a great White Sox fan that he set off the air raid sirens all over the city of Chicago to celebrate the White Sox winning the pennant over Cleveland. Now, the problem was this was during the Cold War, and a lot of people who weren't following the White Sox game said, gee, you know, maybe there's Russian bombers over Wisconsin on their way south. And so Quinn was nice enough to apologize the next day for causing a panic just to celebrate a Chicago White Sox win. But we had Bob Feller was a pitcher for the Chicago Cubs. He had what he called the radio pitch. And the batters were asked, why do you call it the radio pitch? They said, because you can hear it, but you can't see it. So it was, we've had, now, here's one trivia question I'd like to ask you. Can anyone name a famous American living today from Illinois who was an actual eyewitness when Babe Ruth called his shot at Wrigley Field in 1933? You'd have to be both a political and a baseball fan to probably know that one.
It was 1932.
1933, the Game 3 of the World Series. No, I'm sorry, you're right, 32. 32, because Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt was in the stands that day. He was a candidate for president, and so was Mayor Cermak sitting next to him. But when Babe Ruth called his shot, there was a famous American living today who was in the stands. Anybody know? It was Justice John Paul Stevens, who grew up in Hyde Park. He was about 11 years old. He told me this story back in 2008. And we had gone over much of his career about how he, as a Navy intelligence officer, broke the code that enabled American planes to shoot down the plane of Admiral Yamamoto a couple of years after Pearl Harbor. And he said, so we got to talking about all the things he had done outside of the law, in addition to all the things he had done inside the legal profession, including helping to clean up the Illinois Supreme Court in the late 1960s, I think it was. Anybody remember Sherman Skolnick? Sherman Skolnick was always had his own moniker. He was billed as a legal researcher. It was sort of like consumer advocate Ralph Nader. Legal researcher Sherman Skolnick uncovered a lot of skullduggery and bribery going on with the Illinois Supreme Court, and Justice Stevens helped close that case. But he incidentally was related to Charles A. Stevens of the Charles A. Stevens department store, was one of his uncles. His father built the Stevens Hotel that's now long since called the Conrad Hilton at 820 South Michigan Avenue. His father also owned the LaSalle Hotel, one of the worst hotel fires in Chicago history, in 1946. We now have a former president of the Illinois State Society who will be 100 years old on Valentine's Day. She was a survivor of that hotel fire. And just talking to her is getting an oral history of, I introduced her at a party 2 years ago for the Cherry Blossom Festival. I said, this is Virginia Blake. She was University of Illinois class of 1935. Well, there were some more murmurs around the world when I said it was class of 1935, and she could tell that we were trying to do the math in our heads, and she just blurted out, I'm 98, Mark. About an hour later, we went looking for her because we wanted to offer her a ride home or call her a taxi or whatever she needed, and she said, no thanks, I drove my own car, I'm driving home at night. And the doorman saw that I looked a little shaken, and he said, don't worry, she knows her way to Fort Myer Officers Club blindfolded, which she would have to do on a night like this. So people like Virginia Blake are wonderful people to sit down and talk to and get some oral history. So that's what I'm trying to accomplish as we approach. In 2018 will be the bicentennial of statehood for Illinois. The plebiscite that approved statehood was on August the 26th, and on December the 3rd, 1818, the Congress passed the bill to make Illinois the 21st state in the Union. I'm trying to find out if we can't encourage drama teachers all over the state, history teachers all over the state to coordinate, to work together, to celebrate local people. Now, somebody stop me if I'm getting too over my time here, but I'm going to give you one or two examples of people that can be celebrated. Just odd things I found in doing research for my book. In Peoria, there was a couple by the name of Jim and Marion Jordan. Now, you probably wouldn't know them by that name, but on radio, they were called Fibber McGee and Molly. And they were very, very popular shows starting in the 1930s, all the way through 1959, long after the golden age of radio was past and TV had become the dominant medium. Now, Jim and Marion Jordan were really a funny couple. Jim Jordan, I found out, when he was in high school in Peoria, played basketball against one Fulton Sheen, who later became Bishop Fulton Sheen of the Roman Catholic Church. He was born in right near Peoria, grew up there, and he became auxiliary bishop of New York at the time that he had a very popular television show on the Dumont Network, I think it was originally, back in the 1950s, called Life is Worth Living. One time, TV Guide informed Milton Berle that Bishop Sheen actually had higher ratings than Texaco Star Theater with Milton Berle. And Milton Berle, who is Jewish, was very gracious in his response. He said, well, look, the bishop has better writers than I do. And, so Bishop Sheen picked up on that, and when he accepted an Emmy Award a few weeks later, he said, I want to thank my writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He, by the way, is now a candidate for sainthood, and they are doing a great big investigation down in Peoria where he was a practicing parish priest back in the early 1920s, I think it was. So that's just one odd story that I happened to stumble across. I was having I gave a speech in Champaign, sat next to a man who was the historian for the town of Pana, Illinois. Pana is in Christian County, well south of Springfield. And I said, oh, gee, that's interesting. We had a president of the Illinois State Society who was from Pana. And he said, who was that? I said, well, his name was Frank Sanderson. He was the chief usher at the White House for 30 years, from Herbert Hoover to Jack Kennedy. And this guy just shook his head. Somebody from my little town of Pana held that position for 30 years? I said, yeah. And if we can, my hope is that we can encourage more and more students to learn these stories, to celebrate the celebrities that were from Illinois, the people in the arts. We had Fred McMurray from Kankakee. His second wife, June Haver, was from Rock Island. We had the Mary Astor from Quincy. We had Agnes Ayers, who played opposite Rudolph Valentino in The Sheik. She was from Quincy, Illinois. The Five Stars of Danville, that's Dick Van Dyke, Jerry Van Dyke, his brother, Gene Hackman, the actor, Bobby Short, and who? Donald O'Connor, yeah. That's just five from the city of Danville who are nationally known people. And I think one story, and far more recent people that younger students would know now, who are Harrison Ford, of course, from Chicago, his wife from Rochelle, or Rockford?
Calissa Flockhart.
Yeah, from Freeport. She's from Freeport, Illinois. You really have to study up on Illinois geography to keep track of all this stuff. So I want to these students to get them interested in state history, because once they do, they will understand that some of the problems we're facing today are not new problems. There are problems that have been faced before. Just January 19th, Governor Quinn was seated directly in front of me at the Illinois State Society inaugural gala. And I started to tease a little bit about, I said, what would Governor Henry Horner say to us tonight if he could visit us from the year 1933? He'd say to Governor Quinn, Governor, I know you've got a lot of challenges, a lot of budget problems, a lot of pension problems, but look at what I had to face during the Great Depression. We had prisoners grow their own food. We had to use carbon filament lamps in the State House because they weren't very bright, but they lasted a long time. So my sister Cheryl was kidding me that Governor Quinn was taking notes. Let's see, prisoners grow their own food. Carbon filament lamps. And I said to Mayor Emanuel, who was sitting at the next table, I said, what if Mayor Joseph Medill could visit us from the year 1871? What would he say? He'd say, Governor Emanuel, I know you've got a lot of problems, but I lost the entire city to the Great Fire, and in only 22 years we rebuilt it in time for the Columbian Exposition. So I'm down to 3 minutes. Does that include or not include any questions? I'll just leave the last 3 minutes for any questions that anybody has. Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't understand. All right, yeah.
I think this is a really timely book. I'm looking forward to reading it. I love history, and I love all the stories he told. And there are a ton of stories about Illinois. We have a lot to be proud of. And for those of us who have lived in Illinois a long time, we have been proud. But how do you answer those people that say, Illinois, you had a great run, but your best days are behind you? What do you say?
That's nonsense. I mean, each generation renews itself. I think people come along with new ideas and new energies and new desire to succeed. I'm a little bit worried that you don't already have a copy of the book. Mike Madigan promised me that Mike Madigan promised me he put one on every representative's desk. Okay. Oh, that's the one you've got. Okay, thank God. And Senator Cullerton said the same thing. He would put one on each desk over in the Senate. No, I think by studying history, these students can become more aware of what has gone on before, and maybe not get quite so discouraged. They will see that there have been scandals in the past, and again, the Great Depression, the example of Governor Henry Horner, who I teased some people not long ago, some interns, they asked me, who was the best governor of Illinois? I said, well, the best Republican governor of Illinois was a Democrat, Henry Horner, because he was so frugal. I'll give you a story of Henry Horner that I know to be true because it was told to me by somebody who got it firsthand. When he replaced his predecessor, Governor Lewis Emerson, who was a Republican in 1933, January of 1933, his secretary found boxes of stationery printed with the name Governor Lewis L. Emerson at the top. Governor Horner insisted that she use each piece of stationery, cross out the name Lewis L. Emerson, write in the name Henry Horner, and she was not allowed to order any new stationery until the existing supply was gone. Now that's frugality. Yes, sir.
Back to the baseball, I've been following the Steve Bartman incident, which was the 10-year anniversary 2 weeks ago at Wrigley Field. Then the other, you mentioned the Babe Ruth called shot. People don't realize that was at Wrigley. So did Stevens say there's some dispute whether he called a shot or not? Is there any record of whether him as an eyewitness, did Babe Ruth call his shot at Wrigley?
He told me yes, absolutely. He said he pointed out to center field, and the next hit was a home run to center field. Now, as my brother Paul pointed out last night, there was a lot of bad blood that had built up to that moment. There was a lot of taunting, the Cubs bench taunting the Yankees bench, and Ruth in particular. And apparently, Paul said he's seen a film of Babe Ruth rounding the bases, not the actual pointing or the actual home run, but rounding the bases afterwards. And then he sort of gestured wildly at the Cubs bench in sort of defiance. So there was a lot of hostility going on between the Cubs and the Yankees in that particular series. But basically, he absolutely said yes, he called the shot, and the next one was a home run. So whether he was pointing at center field or pointing at the Cub pitcher, Charlie Root, the next one was a home run. Yes?
I enjoyed it very, very much. So.
Nancy Thorner from Illinois Review, by the way.
Okay, but I'd like to look up the website that you gave. It's Procraft that I can look up and get copies of newspapers and find things like that. Is it available to everyone? Procraft. Is it possible, what is the web address again? You said Procraft.
ProQuest. Yeah, you can, I think you can go on the Chicago Tribune and find something about archives, click on that. You don't need to go to ProQuest, you can go through the particular newspaper, or you could also go to ProQuest directly, set up an account, and it's a great resource. You can search by subject matter or keyword, and you can, vanity, I've searched for my own name, so that I could find out, and I found some amazing stuff. I mean, things that happened when I was a child was in the local paper or something. So it's a great resource.
Well, thank you.
Great.
Do you have any insight or any stories about interaction between the mob and politicians in Chicago?
About the mob?
About criminals and the politicians interacting in Chicago?
Yeah, there was a great book written by, golly, I'm going to struggle for the author's name. He also wrote a book about Meyer Lansky that got Lansky deported from Israel. Henry Messick. It's called The Politics of Prosecution. The subtitle is Marge Everett, Otto Kerner, Jim Thompson, and the Racetrack Scandals.
I published that one too.
I'm sorry, you published that one too? You're kidding me. I didn't know that, Jim. Well, it's a terrific book. I once asked Jim Thompson about what his reaction to the book was, and he said, well, they sort of criticized me for giving immunity from prosecution to a lot of people to get higher up people, but that's how I was able to make those cases. So thank you again so much for inviting me.